Okay, so today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite art forms, which is actually tie-dye. Tie-dye is something really you can do at any age. It's just something that's really fun, and I personally just enjoy doing. I think I like it because not only does it make me happy, but when I see other people doing it, it seems to make them really happy too. So tie-dye is way more than you think. Most people just associate it with the 1960s, the hippie movement, the Woodstocks. Tie-dye really never goes out of style. It's been around for a long time. Most people consider it a new art form. They think it just developed in the 1960s. Tie-dyeing is actually part of something called resist dyeing. And what that is a technique using twisting, binding, stitching to prevent the dye from actually adhering to the fabric in those certain patterns. And there's different ways you can do that. In tie-dyeing, we tend to use rubber bands. In India, they have a type of dyeing. We're going to do that one later. It's called batiking. And here we see an example, and they're using hot wax, and then they dip it in the dye. And wherever the hot wax was, it actually prevents that dye from adhering to the fabric. So they can come out with some really intricate designs. If you've never done that, you may have colored a piece of paper with a white crayon and use some watercolors on top of it, then the white crayon really shows through. That's just another form of resist dyeing, but in that case it's resist painting. So tie-dye has a rich history. It has roots in many cultures such as China, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Peru. Anthropologists think that it developed independently. It did not develop in one country necessarily and spread to another. They think that it actually was developed by each group separately. So why don't we see many fabrics, ancient fabrics, that show us all this tie-dyeing? Well, when you put fabric in the ground, it decays really quickly. It's not like a bone, it's not like a fossil or a rock, or even a piece of wood. Fabric does decay really easily. And back then they used mostly hemp and silk, so they were natural fabrics, and they did decay pretty quickly. We were really lucky, and there's a few cases that anthropologists and archaeologists have found. One is in Peru, and they had mummies that were atop these mountains, and so things were really well preserved, and they were able to have fabric samples, and that's one of the reasons they know that this developed around the world. They also know that it's been around a really, really long time. So there's different techniques. The first thing to know is that there were no synthetic dyes. So when you wanted to tie-dye, you had to actually go out and make your own dye, which meant you had to find flowers or roots or grind up charcoal to make those colors. And then you would bring your water to a boil, which was usually over an open fire, take a really long time, and you would dip your fabric in with the dye in that boiling water. So the Shiburi Technique came out of Japan. We know it dates back to about the 500s or the 6th century. They would dye using these blue colors, mostly geometric patterns, and they would make their kimonos out of it. So it was beautiful, beautiful fabrics came out of it. We also have another technique that came out of India. It's called the Bandhani technique. These patterns are actually created from teeny tiny little pinch circles. Instead of like in tie-dyeing we have these giant circles, they use teeny tiny ones here, so you actually see her like sewing it in there. And then we also have the African technique, which is more like what we're used to seeing today. They used bright, vibrant colors. They even did it similarly. Now, they didn't have rubber bands, so they would use long, thin pieces of grass, and they would wrap it around the fabric. And because it's grass, sometimes the dye would seep underneath, and you would get that kind of faded or kind of blotchy effect that we actually love today. Tie-dye in the United States. Tie-dye has actually been around in the United States a lot longer than you think. In the 1920s, it was a really cheap, effective way to create, make your clothes look new again, or try to mimic really expensive fabrics. So they would use dyes and do that. In the 1960s is when it really took off, and that's kind of when it became the art form that we really think of today. There was a big concert, Woodstock, And several really big artists, Janis Joplin, John Sebastian, Joe Cocker, they were wearing tie-dye items on stage. And when people saw that, they really, really wanted it for themselves. Also in the 1960s, there was this little company that most people didn't know who it was called Rit Dye. And when they saw those designs, they realized, wow, this could be really good for my company. And so they started seeking out designers and showing them how they could use their synthetic dyes to create really vibrant, really great tie-dyed clothes. So, tie-dye today. In 2016, two designers, Elijah Funk and Alex Ross, launched a company in tie-dye. They made a lot of their clothes out of it. Some famous artists saw it, and it kind of took off again from that. So here they are. Okay, popular artists such as like John Mayer started wearing tie-dye that he wore, Birkenstocks. People saw it. It's the same thing as kind of the 1960s, and they realized, yeah, I really like that. And these two guys made it modern. They started making clothes that we wear today, that same styles, but using tie-dye fabric. And so it really, really took off. We see fashion designers using it on the runway today. Again, it just gives it a fresh new feel, and people have really embraced tie-dye again. So we're going to do tie-dye today two different ways. We're going to use, the first one is a Sharpie Tie Dye Method. This one uses Sharpies and alcohol, rubber bands. If you want to take a screenshot here, you're welcome to. And then the other method today we're going to use is that RIT, or the liquid tie dye method. I will say both methods are a little bit messy, so you're definitely going to want to prep your work area. And today we're going to be tie-dyeing masks, but you can tie-dye anything you want. If you want to do a t-shirt, sheets, the only one I really don't recommend would be socks. Socks don't hold the tie-dye very well. Alright, so we'll see you in just a minute.
Alright, so we're going to do our first technique, which is Sharpies. I have regular Sharpies, I actually have dollar store Sharpies, and we're going to use a little bit of alcohol. You don't need it in a spray bottle, you could always drop it on as well. And we're just going to draw on your design.
Souls die in a fire, and the rest left to wonder why. 24 floors glowing in the dawn, burns hurtling to the afterlife.
Alright, so now we're going to do method number 2, which is actually using liquid dye. These I actually purchased over the internet. RIT dye works just as well. This has several steps to it, but it is much quicker. You can see I really prepped my area though, because this stuff really is permanent. So I have a tablecloth on, and then I've learned over the years by tie dyeing, it's nice to have like a junk towel or something to absorb it as it rolls off, or just so the dye that spills off doesn't get the place a total mess. So I also have gloves, rubber bands, and some water. What you're going to want to make sure you do is have an idea of what you want to do beforehand. So I'm going to do my masks first, and I'm going to actually take off my watch because I do not want to tie-dye my watch either. Okay, and we are going to take a mask. These are all cotton. If you use synthetic blend, it doesn't dye, it doesn't hold the dye as well. So I dip it in some nice cool water. This step is really, really important. It sounds counterintuitive, but it really helps the dye hold much better. So I wring it out as much as I can. Okay, and I am actually going to do a kind of stripe effect. So you see I am actually accordion folding or fan folding, whichever you want to call it, the material. I am not including the straps in there in the fan folding, but they will get put in here when I do this part. Okay, and I'm gonna put the rubber bands on. Now the rubber bands, you want to make as tight as you possibly can. Okay, anywhere there's a rubber band, I'm going to take off my gloves. Anywhere there's a rubber band, it's not going to get underneath. So you want to just make sure it's like super, super, super tight. Okay, if you tie your rubber bands really loose, it's going to get right up underneath there, and you're not going to have a pretty design. It's just part of being a resist. We want to block off that area. So if you're a little person, you may need to have a big person help you with this part. Alright, so there's number one, and I'm going to do number two. I'm going to do this part first. And I'm going to show you how to do a shirt too, because it can be a little different. This one I'm going to do what is like your traditional starburst. So I'm going to take it from the middle, okay? I'm going to pull it this way, and then I'm going to start putting rubber bands to create that starburst effect. Okay, there's number two. Now we're going to do a cotton t-shirt. You can find these anywhere. Just make sure it's a nice cotton t-shirt. Again, synthetics don't take as well. You want to get as much water out as you can. Okay, now I could do either one of those patterns on my t-shirt. This time I'm actually going to do a little bit of a different kind of thing. Let me move some of my supplies out of the way. Let me even move my cloth for a second. I'm going to lay my shirt flat, and this creates a really neat kind of odd spirally effect to your shirt. All right, so I have my shirt all laid out, and I'm going to take it in the middle, and I'm just going to twist it up. There we go. This can be a little bit tricky, and you want to get it into a nice tight circle shape. There we go. I basically got the whole t-shirt creamed in this little ball. Alright. Definitely want my gloves on for this part. Alright, now the key is, depending on how dark you want it, that's about how much liquid you need. You don't need near as much liquid as you think. When I do the large tie-dye programs at the library, I can usually do about 80 shirts. Plus a set of king sheets out of all this dye. So you don't need as much dye as you think. It takes a lot less. Alright, this one. Starburst. Start with my stripes. Just make sure it's nice and saturated, not oversaturated. Okay. Just saturated enough so it's a little bit drippy. Okay, and you know you've got it wet enough when it's absorbing just like that. That's a big part of the reason you wet it down. Otherwise, it would just roll right off. All right, here's number 1. Set that aside for Harold, my friend, and you have on gloves, so it will cross-contaminate your pieces. Make sure that you dry them off when you pick up your next piece. This one isn't quite wet enough. It's a little hard. See how it's just rolling off the top there? I needed to get it a little bit wetter. All right, Miss Deborah, we got something for you. Now, I'm going to take off my gloves. I'm going to put those 2 in a bag. And we're going to let these sit for 24 hours. If you forget, let them sit for 36 or longer. That's just fine. Okay, I want to make sure they're not touching inside that bag. I'm very carefully going to move these out of the way. And we're going to work on my shirt next. So you see I've cleaned up my surface just a little bit. I didn't want any of those other colors to get on my shirt. And now we're going to do a rainbow shirt. So I'm just going to start with some purple. And I'm just going to do the different sections, different colors. Really kind of sopping wet shirt there. I'm going to put that in my bag and we'll let it sit for 24 hours or more. Tie this up, and when you get it out, you're going to rinse it in cold water, and then you can wash it in your washer. I usually wash it the first time with no soap, but just make sure you rinse it really good. Cold water, you can put a little bit of vinegar in there when you wash it.